and Communication, Arts and Social Sciences at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. She studies the intricacies of the relationship between technology and society. I'm going to introduce you all in turn before I ask for your presentations. Yeah. Our next panelist is Tyrion George, Professor of Media Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University and the founder of the Asia Journalism Forum in Singapore. He is a pioneering scholar on hate propaganda and free speech. Wow, that's, yeah, hate propaganda. That's really relevant to us here and now. And our final panelist is Edson Tandok, who is a professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His research focuses on the sociology of message construction, and his studies about influence on journalists have focused on the impact of journalistic roles and audience feedback. I guess we'll start off with the presentation of Sansan.
I have a PowerPoint which...
Yes, I think it's been loaded. Is this it?
Yes, yes, thank you. So,
can you dim the lights, please?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and it's such a pleasure to be back in Manila, always. For the longest time, I was a junior diplomat, and I would come to Manila a lot because I was working on ASEAN. And then after that, I had a 20-year drought where I didn't come to Manila until 2 years ago, and so it's really wonderful to be back again. So I was asked by Cheryl, our lovely host and conference organizer, to speak about the psychological factors that influence why people might be so susceptible to fake news or online falsehoods, which is the new catchphrase in Singapore. We no longer call it fake news, we call it online falsehoods. So, so what I'm going to be talking about today are really the cognitive biases that predispose people to fake news. And if you could just go to the next slide. So as it stands, we have actually an interesting situation. We've got what you can call the perfect storm. You've got the technological landscape, which is an environment where everyone has got mobile devices, media devices that help them to connect to one another. And this is a technological landscape where we are deluged with multiple sources of news and information, where we all have the power in our hands to share that news so that the news disseminates very quickly. And because of the deluge of information that is coming at us in torrents, we also then have to take cognitive shortcuts in terms of processing all of this information. And sometimes, we become a little bit more overloaded. We become a little bit more careless, and we make snap judgments in terms of what we should or should not share. So there's that technological landscape. Now, at the same time, there's also the interesting socio-cultural climate that has, in many ways, been influenced by technology. But at the same time, there's also the socio-cultural factors around sharing. We've always been a sort of sociable, humans are by nature social. We interact with our peers, with our networks. We love to share. We love to look updated. And increasingly, you find, for example, on WhatsApp groups, there is always that instinct to want to be that person who's the most updated in terms of sharing things with your friends. And there's even sometimes also that pro-social supposition that when people share such important news that they are being helpful and that there is some kind of valorization of this kind of behavior. So there are sort of social norms that seem to encourage the sharing of information in as timely a fashion as possible. Now, on top of the technological landscape as well as the socio-cultural climate, there's also ultimately the cognitive biases which I will be talking about. And these are really the psychological factors that will, to some extent, influence the ways in which we process or fail to process the information that comes at us. And that's how, in these circumstances, if these cognitive biases are allowed to take over, if you will, that you will become much more vulnerable to the falsehoods that you encounter. So next slide, please. Now, the first is actually optimism bias, and I believe Edson might talk a little bit about optimism bias shortly, so I will be somewhat brief. Optimism bias is essentially that feeling that, you know, you're overconfident in your own abilities, right? You think you are extremely smart, you think you are young, technologically savvy, and therefore you are very unlikely to fall prey to fake news. Because, hey, you're too smart. So you are falsely optimistic, overconfident, and I believe in Howie's presentation, Howie had the interesting stats about how, you know, on the one hand, Philippines was top 3 in terms of people who misperceive the news. On the other hand, it was also top 3 in terms of being confident in their abilities to understand the news. So that, in fact, is optimism bias at work, right? Next slide, please. Now, of course, there's also confirmation bias, and sometimes, you know, there's also another principle called motivated reasoning. The two are quite similar. Essentially, confirmation bias refers to the fact that as individuals, we are very, very, you know, we're very inclined to listen to people whose views agree or resonate with our own. And when someone's views run counter to ours, we just kind of shut it out. We have no motivation to listen, and we really want to sort of just be in our own little, you know, echo chamber and just listen to the views that we want to hear. So that's confirmation bias. You want to hear views that confirm your own, that validate your own, that make you feel good that all this while you were right, right? So next slide, please. Now, of course, there's also naive realism, and the naive realism is quite similar to confirmation bias in the sense that you generally have this strong tendency to believe that only your view is right, and that your perception of reality is the right perception, and that everyone else's, you know, is unreal, less valid than yours. And so it's that naive sense that only it's your way or the highway, right? So that's naive realism. Again, also quite similar to confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. Next slide, please. So on top of all this, and this in some ways intersects with what I was talking about earlier with the socio-cultural climate, because there's the social network effect, which is that when you are receiving information from people within your own social network, the likelihood of you believing the information is much higher, simply because these are people whom you've interacted with, you've grown to like them, you've grown to trust them, and therefore you let your guard down when you receive information from them because you believe that they care for you, and therefore they must have already verified the information before they bothered to send it to you. So the social network effect has also been seen to be at play when people are more vulnerable to fake news. So, you know, you might have received fake news from some random acquaintance or random stranger. You might be less inclined to believe it because you and that person don't have that long social history of interaction. But with your trusted friends, you're like, oh yeah, of course, I believe everything Edson tells me, right? So then the likelihood of you falling for it is higher. So the last one, I believe, is the illusory truth effect. Now, the illusory truth effect is really what has been probably the trump card of fake news, pun intended, which is that essentially when you repeat something often enough, it will start to seem true. And interestingly, there has also been research that has found that the illusory truth effect comes into play when you try to debunk fake news. Because when you are reasserting a particular piece of fake news, in order to debunk it, you are merely amplifying the original falsehood. And that again gives more airtime, it gives more airplay to the original piece of fake news, and it just is another reiteration, it's another reassertion, it's another rearticulation. Every repeat of that fake news makes it seem more true, makes it seem more believable. So it's really, you know, quite a dicey situation that we're in. And I believe that's all the theories that I will give you at this hour of the day. But it's important to sum up. In sum, essentially, there are quite a range of cognitive biases that can influence our ability to process information objectively and critically, and that one of the key frontiers of media literacy education has really got to be to make people aware of these cognitive biases. I think we've done a lot of the, oh, you should check the facts, you should verify, you should look at the URL, you should do this, you should do that. But with public media literacy education, there hasn't been enough done to stress to people that you've got to be aware of your cognitive biases when you're processing information. And that's really what will sort of be able to make you more discerning and more discriminating as a media consumer. So.
Thank you very much, Sansan. That's it's rather eye-opening. And now I think we have another presentation, this time from Edson. Can you load his presentation, please?
All right. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Edson Tandok from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. It's also nice to be back in Manila after a month. I spent New Year's Eve here. I was also originally from the Philippines. I worked for the Inquirer for about 6 years. So it was also fascinating to see the earlier panel bringing together journalists talking about fake news. I'm missing out on the fun of being a journalist in the Philippines at this time, but at least I get to still do some research on fake news. So what I'll be doing this afternoon is I'll be sharing some of the results of series of surveys and experiments that we've done at NTU in Singapore with some of my colleagues there. But first, we have one paper that we published trying to define fake news. I know it's a controversial term. People are disagreeing whether we should still continue using that term. What we did in this paper is we actually looked at the literature, meaning studies that have been published before, and look at how they define fake news. I mean, fake news as a term is not new, but they've defined it in different ways. Some have considered political satire, such as Daily Show as examples of fake news. Others considered The Onion as fake news. Others examined propaganda, press releases as examples of fake news. Advertising, misleading advertising, even advertorials were once labeled as fake news. And then now we go into photo manipulation and fabricated stories. There is a group of scholars that have coined the term truth decay, arguing that fake news is just one aspect of, you know, a wave of truth decay, marked by an increased focus, not just only focus on opinion over fact, but also increase in volume of opinion that we're seeing online. And also marked by an increasing mistrust on important institutions such as the press. There are, I know there are debates on whether we should still continue using fake news. For me, and this is a work in progress, I think there is a phenomenon that is actually defined by the term fake news. So if you look at this, we can look at the news format. We can look at the level of facticity, and we can look at the intention to deceive. Now, there are things that look like news that might get things wrong, but they're not intended to deceive. Those could be just journalists getting it wrong, right? There are fabricated accounts of things that are intended to deceive, but they don't look like news, but they're still under the umbrella term of disinformation. So I think there is some utility in focusing on the term fake news, especially in the studies that I do. I actually looked at pieces of information that try to look or disguise themselves as news, trying to appropriate the legitimacy that we attribute and associate with legitimate news stories. But they are low in facticity and high in the intention to deceive. Also, it's important to understand that fake news is just part of this overall ecosystem of misinformation and disinformation that specifies a specific phenomenon. So in terms of how concerned we are, so I did a simple Google Trends search a few days ago. So Google Trends, those of you who use it, it just measures how often people search for a particular term in relation to the total searches. So you see here that worldwide, interest over time peaked around the time around the U.S. elections in 2016. And if you look at the top three countries interested in this, you would see United States, and Philippines is second, and Singapore is third. So definitely it makes me feel good about my research, being a Filipino based in Singapore. An educator in the US, yeah. So that's my research agenda. So yeah, and my research on fake news stems from my interest in journalism. Now that I've already looked at how journalists do their work, I'm also getting interested in how people process news that they consume, and this led me to the study of fake news. So I've mapped my research agenda on fake news using the SMCR model, Berlo communication model, looking at sender, message, channel, and receiver. And if you look at each of those, we can map out different variables that can explain why people might become vulnerable to fake news. So we can look at the sender. Is it a credible or a familiar sender? In the age of social media, the credible source, as we traditionally define it, might not be the familiar source. The familiar source might be our friends or family or relatives, and we might associate them with different levels of trust. Some people also coin the term proximate or distal sources on social media. So if you have a news story published by the Inquirer, shared by your friend becomes the proximate source, the source closer to you. Inquirer remains to be the distal source, right? Now, it depends on how much you trust Inquirer versus how much you trust your friend, that those two types of sources might interact and affect the degree to which you believe in the story. We can also look at the message. A lot of fake news stories are able to fool people because of their plausibility, that there might be some truth to it, right? So your radioactive sushi, for example, right? Those of you who love sushi, there's some plausibility to it. So we also look at message. We also look at format, whether it's in the form of a tweet, whether it's the form of and tweet is not necessarily a news story, but we've come to associate tweets with breaking news, right? So when we see something that's looking like a tweet, we have some associations already in our brain in terms of how much we believe in that information. And then also we look at the channel. Facebook, I think, has been resisting labeling itself as a media entity, right? They still consider themselves as tech company. But for some people, if you ask them, where do you get your news from? They would say Facebook. Others would say, how do you verify whether information you get is true? They would say they do it via Google. So these tech companies are increasingly being perceived as sources or even channels of information. And whether it's also closed or open, that might also affect the extent to which fake news spreads and how able we are to check on it. For example, Facebook, if you post on a wall that's visible to other people, some people can post a correction or say it's not true. But if the exchange of misinformation or disinformation occurs in closed apps like WhatsApp or Viber, that's more difficult to track, right? If the exchange is between a mom and her daughter, right, or a friend and another friend, that's more difficult to track. Also, the receiver, and Sansan already talked about the different types of biases that we have, lenses that we use to examine messages. Those are also very important. And also feedback. Some people look at just number of likes. We've done focus groups, ask people, how do you verify if information you see in social media is correct? Some said they would look at the number of likes. And also some would say they will look at who liked it. And I have friends who I love dearly and I thought are very smart, rational people, and I would see them like posts that are actually fake. Also, the impact of corrections, which I'll discuss later on, and also the context itself. The effect of fake news becomes more pronounced during periods of instability. When people crave for information and there's high demand for information, but there's low supply, then people become more vulnerable to believing in whatever information comes in the earliest. But then also when you have information overload, when the information supply is high, but people don't really have enough cognitive capacity to pay attention to every single piece of information they come across, then they tend to rely on shortcuts. Who shared it? How many likes it got? So these other variables operate in a particular context. So some specific studies that we've done at NTU, one was an experiment involving 189 students at, okay, okay, so let's just go with this one. What do you do when you read false news on social media? Sorry, I wasn't cueing the projector, but so yeah, here we asked in a survey what people do when they read false news on social media. So as you can see, we have the majority saying they just ignore the wrong post. So there are different options that you can do when you see misinformation or disinformation on social media. And we did this in 2 waves. As you can see, the percentage of people who said they would ignore the wrong post frequently or very frequently decreased a little bit between 2016 and 2017. So it looks like all these things that we're doing, that we're discussing, are working. And this was done in Singapore. So I'm not sure whether we would also see the same trends in the Philippines. But yeah, this is, I think, an important development. But still, majority of people would ignore wrong posts. So the next research that I've done looks at, why would people ignore and what would make them actually correct misinformation when they encounter one. So if we go to the next slide, so based on dyadic interviews we've done, meaning we've interviewed pairs, and they vary in their types of relationship. It could be a parent and a child. It could be 2 friends or a couple. So we've asked them how willing they are to correct someone if they see misinformation. So responses we got would say, well, they're willing to correct someone if it's a friend, someone they're close with but not very close. They will just say what you posted was wrong. But others said if it's her mom, she would be very careful because she didn't want to hurt her mom. So she would be very subtle. She would say, did you check this? Did you verify this? But would not call out that, hey, mom, you shared something that's fake. Others said if it's an anonymous post, they would rather not comment because they want to stay away from any potential argument. They just don't want to be involved in it. Now that seems contradictory to what we see on all these angry posts and uncivil discourse that we see, right, where anonymous people just keep on arguing with each other. But I think it also depends on how relevant you feel the issue is. And some people might feel that, some of our respondents said if they feel it's an important issue, then they would be more, they would feel more obliged to correct misinformation when they see it. So next slide, we'll look at how people feel when they're corrected. So it could be that my working hypothesis, and I could be wrong, so that's why we're doing this series of studies, is that there might be some stigma in terms of correcting other people in the context of social media, because social media is built on relationships, right? The goal of social media is we try to grow our network, we try to maintain connections with friends, we try to make new friends, and so correcting might be against the unspoken rules of social media. And this can be seen in people's responses when we ask them how do they feel when someone corrected them. So some people said they felt ashamed, they felt they were stupid, and because of that they took down some posts. But an interesting response also said that yeah, it was shameful, but instead of deleting that post, she would just share more to drown the earlier post. Right, and that behavior can make people more vulnerable into sharing even more misinformation and disinformation. So yeah, the next series of studies that we're doing will be focusing more on what would make people correct and why is it that most people refuse to correct misinformation when they see one. And Facebook has that function, and I've used this with a former teacher that I've had way back in grade school, high school. Yeah. So he posted that a news it looked like a news story saying the Pope is actually the devil, right? So I reported that. I used the Facebook function to report that post. Once in a while, it would have the function that you're reporting it because you think it's fake news. But once in a while, when I do it, it would disappear. But when I did that with this post, it was there. But it took Facebook about 4 days before they took it down. Facebook would also send a automated message, which you can edit, to the person who posted it. It's a very polite message. I tweaked it, and I said, well, you were my teacher. There are a lot of us who look up to you. And I think some people might misunderstand the reason you're posting it. They might think that you think it's true. Because he told me that the reason he posted it was he wasn't sure. So he wanted confirmation from other people. That's why he shared it. But by sharing it to some extent, you are, in a way, endorsing, if not propagating, something that is obviously false. So, yeah, the next slide will be, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edson. And now, let's hear a few words from Tyrion.
Thank you very much, Bart. First of all, I want to thank Sansan and Edson for doing 1/3 of my intended job for me, because this panel is supposed to look at the why of the effectiveness of fake news. And I thought, well, we should look at the demand side, the supply side, and maybe the message side. On the demand side, I'm on very thin ice because that is really outside my area of expertise. It goes into behavioral science, social psychology, and so on. And I'm very glad that you've done that for us, right? So I won't need to refer to it at all. I'd like to address this question by taking us on a journey to a large Asian democracy that is not the Philippines, right? To India, yeah? And I'd like to give you the example of what to me is one of the most pernicious, frightening, and effective disinformation campaigns of the 21st century. And the Russians are not behind it. It's happening in India right now. It's been going on for maybe 10 years, and it's called the love jihad. You've heard about the jihad, of course, but this is the love jihad. This is a conspiracy theory that is peddled by right-wing Hindu nationalists that Muslims in India are engaged in a plot to seduce Hindu girls and women away from their families and then to forcibly convert them. And this is supposedly part of a grand strategy to conquer India through demographic revolution. Hindus now make up 80%, almost 80% of the country's population. But since Muslim men are allowed 4 wives, not that all of them take advantage of this privilege, the theory is that Muslims will quickly out-reproduce Hindus and turn Hindus into a subjugated minority, right? This theory is ridiculous on its face, and one of the amazing things about this is, the civilization that made a great contribution to mathematics, that is running IT in Silicon Valley and so on, can actually believe what is so obviously a mathematical impossibility. Yeah? There is simply no basis to assume that the 15% Muslim population could actually become the majority, even if they succeeded in the so-called love jihad. But it's no laughing matter. It's ridiculous, but no laughing matter. Muslim men have been put on hit lists because of their supposed involvement in love jihad. They've been lynched. Consensual marriages have been broken up. Women forced to return to their families. So this, by the way, is not just anti-Muslim, but it's also an attack on the autonomy of women. And it's not only about family honor. The love jihad theory has been elevated from grassroots, homespun gossip to industrial strength propaganda because of its usefulness in elections, in high stakes elections. Hindu nationalist politicians belonging to the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's party have used the love jihad hoax to incite deadly communal riots in selected constituencies to solidify the Hindu base there in the run-up to elections. And there is some evidence that it has actually worked. Yeah? Hate propaganda of this sort, or hate spin as I term it in my recent book, has been around for a long time. It's been studied for a long time. So when we look at phenomena like the love jihad conspiracy theory, we can actually approach it with some analytical tools. Because unfortunately, as I said, this is not new. Scholars looking at what's behind ethnic cleansings, genocides, and so on, know that part and parcel of that violence is disinformation or hate speech against vulnerable communities. We know that there is a certain step-by-step process that hate propagandists go through. They start by constructing in-groups based on very salient identities like race, religion, national identity. The other side of the coin of an in-group, of course, is an out-group. And these out-groups are simultaneously constructed and then demonized and scapegoated. The out-groups are blamed for things that are going wrong in their society. This rhetoric then is used to justify discrimination or worse. In the extreme, this kind of hate propaganda successfully convinces the in-group that they are in fact the victims. They are under threat. They may make up 80–90% of the population, but no, they need to be fearful of this minority of 2% in the case of Jews in Europe, or 15% as in the case of Muslims in India. And because the majority is under threat of losing their families, their properties, and so on, violence against the minority is actually an act of self-defense. Yeah? And we can see this working with chilling regularity through the 20th century, and unfortunately now even in the 21st. The love jihad in India, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, all these show that this cycle of hate is alive and well as a political strategy. Why does it work? As I said, I'm glad that the demand side of the equation has been taken care of. Let me look at some of the characteristics of the messaging that goes into these hate campaigns. The first thing to note is that hate propaganda of this sort is never entirely made up, right? So it is not in the class of Hillary Clinton has an alien baby. Yeah? That there is instead always a grain of truth in it. So for example, the myth that we should think of ourselves as belonging to a tight in-group and respond that way. Well, race and religion, although those who study social sciences and humanities will know to a certain extent, social constructions, they're not total fictions. The lie isn't in telling a Hindu that he's Hindu, or telling a Muslim that he's Muslim. No, that's not the lie. Or telling a white American that he's white and not brown. The lie is in telling these people that these are the only identities that matter and that they should ignore cross-cutting identities such as class, gender, and of course our shared belonging to the human race. That's the lie. Yeah? Similarly, the grievances that are stoked by hate propagandists are not totally imaginary either. Hindu girls do run away with young Muslim men. And such marriages across religion, or more often across caste lines, can be extremely traumatic for very conservative families. But the disinformation is in convincing the majority community that such occurrences are part of a grand conspiracy rather than the age-old mysteries of the heart. Right? The economic grievances that drive people to extreme solutions, that drive people to scapegoat minorities, are also not entirely made up. There are people, citizens, even in majority communities, even in seemingly privileged communities, may have genuine economic grievances, may have genuine economic insecurities, and they are looking for answers. So that's point number one, that these messages tend to tap Number one, on latent prejudices, but also on legitimate anxieties. It converts these into fear, and then the fear is transformed into hate and bad behavior of all kinds. There's a political message, of course, also embedded in these campaigns, which is that complex problems have simple causes that can be fixed by strong leaders. And it is much easier, as I mentioned earlier this morning, it is much easier to sell this message than the truth, that there are in fact no simple solutions, that solutions will involve sacrifices by all citizens, especially by those with wealth and power, and that democracy in fact requires a certain care, a duty of care for strangers in our midst. These are much harder to get across. Moving on to the supply side, what is it that makes these communicators so effective? Disinformation-laden hate propaganda is powerful because it is pushed by resourceful, resource-rich actors. To go back to the love jihad example, we shouldn't underestimate the sophistication or the determination behind it. I think the opponents, those championing democracy and human rights, journalists, academics, sometimes make the mistakes that because the ideas being pushed are so stupid, the people behind them must be too. Right? It's far from the case. We're dealing with extremely sophisticated public relations practitioners, creative types and so on, who are spending a lot of time, a lot of energy into pushing their messages, which are stupid, but they're not. Yeah? So don't underestimate the resources behind them. In the case of the Love Jihad campaign, let me give you the kinds of things that they do. It includes making up fake birth certificates to prove that the so-called girls being abducted are below age and therefore their husbands are rapists. It includes making multiple police reports at various stations to get men into trouble. My favorite example, because it's just so damn creative, I mean, it's the kind of thing that should win an advertising award, is that they put up posters highlighting the love jihad problem. And to me, the most effective thing about it is this line at the bottom that gives a hotline number. So basically, if your family, if you know a girl who's been a victim of the love jihad, call this toll-free number. Think about how ingenious that is. When we see a hotline number being promoted, don't we automatically assume that there is, in fact, a problem? Yeah? It got me thinking, what is the best way to kill, say, the iPhone market in any country? Just put up posters saying, if your iPhone catches fire, call this hotline. Let's put that everywhere. Won't many people start wondering if, in fact, your iPhones are unsafe? And that's exactly the genius behind this, the Love Jihad hotline. Yeah? There probably isn't even anyone at the end of the line. They don't need to get an Infosys call center or call center in the Philippines to manage the calls, but the job is done. It convinces people that there is, in fact, a real problem to be solved. So that's the ingenuity of the things that they do. I want to also highlight what I hope is obvious from this example that I've given, that this is not particularly a social media problem. It's not even an internet problem. I think one of the, as a scholar of hate, and I think I speak for the entire community of scholars who've been looking at hate speech, hate propaganda, genocides, et cetera, for a long time, we can tell you that the internet has extremely little to do with it. It is severely underestimating the determination and skill of the propagandists behind them if we think that they are at all dependent on the internet. Right? So yes, of course, the internet is there and they're able to use it, they will use it. But fix the problem on the internet, get Facebook to solve the problem, is that going to suggest that the problem goes away? No, they'll find other means. They'll find posters with hotline numbers, they'll make police reports, etc. These are ingenious activists who can match any social activist, any civil society activist on the planet. Yeah? That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with multi-platform, multi-skilled, multimedia phenomena. These are purveyors who are able and willing to put money and creativity into the problem, And the challenge is to be aware of it and match them step by step. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tyrion. Even before the three of them ended their respective presentations, I've got a whole bunch of them already. But this is a very interesting topic because one thing I'd like to ask you before I go to my question is, we know that there is a playbook that is followed. I mean, throughout the 20th century, and even before that, it's been going around in cycles. For example, the Nazis, the persecution of the, of whole populations, even during the Roman times, and so on and so forth. Why does it keep happening? Or are people really vulnerable to being played by hate groups? Anyone want to answer that? Why does it seem so cyclical, in other words? Why does it keep repeating?
Why does it keep happening? Because it works. I mean, powerful people realize that one good way to maintain or to get power is to get the so-called mob on their side. And a very easy way to get the mob on your side is to construct an image of themselves as being part of an in-group and demonize an out-group. And just to give you an example of how well established this trend is, and how it's got really nothing to do with, at least if you're talking about hate propaganda, it's nothing to do with the internet, is something I learned from a historian friend of mine when I organized a conference last year on disinformation. And he's been looking at propaganda in the colonial era, 19th century propaganda, Farish Noor at NTU, right? And he gave an example from the Philippines and how the Americans, to help justify their violent colonization of the Philippines, practically overnight changed their depiction of Filipinos and the Philippines for their domestic. The Americans were getting pressure domestically about, on the fact that they were doing something that seemed un-American. They were engaging this colonial conquest, violent colonial conquest of a distant land. And practically overnight, comic strips, newspapers, and so on that used to portray Filipinos as distinguished, civilized culture suddenly started portraying them like monkeys. Yeah, so you can see this, and I guess those of you who studied history will know this. Yeah, that's how the framing and the depiction of Filipinos changed as a result of what was basically foreign expeditionary adventures of the US empire. Yeah? So why does it keep happening? Because powerful interests find this extremely useful. Yeah? And you can't distinguish, so one of the problems I find with a lot of the discourse, a lot of the analysis of fake news and disinformation today is that it seems very innocent. It's about individual internet users and little bits of fake news being shared. Let's get real, that the really dangerous stuff is being pushed by extremely powerful agents, as it always has been.
It's very interesting because I think one of the easiest way to unify people is emotionally. If you get them to hate something in common, then it's easier to, if you identify a common enemy, then it's easier to get people. Or if, in our case, if you get them to love something like Alden Richards and Maine Mendoza, then you get them to unify, right? I was looking at your study, Sansan, and interestingly enough, that you've been able to identify the vulnerabilities, the conditions that make us vulnerable to accepting fake news. how much of it would you say this emotions, it involves emotions?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I'll get to it. But I wanted to sort of join the dots with what Tyrion just said, and also your original question as to why it is that people continue to use this playbook. And ultimately, it's really about vested interests wanting legitimacy. And also, to resonate with Tyrion's point about how a lot of the discussion on fake news today seems to be somewhat ahistorical, right? When you think about the long history of fake news and propaganda. So if you ever have a chance to go to Singapore, I strongly encourage you to go to this place called the Old Fort Factory, which is where the British actually surrendered to the Japanese forces. And the British were in severe denial about the fact that the Japanese were at our doorsteps, until, of course, they had to, surrender at the Old Fort Factory. So what's been done is that the National Archives of Singapore has transformed the Old Fort Factory into a fantastic museum where they talk about the entire surrender of the British to the Japanese just before the Japanese occupation. And one of the most fascinating displays for me was something called the London Illustrated News, which was a news magazine that was weekly, I think, and it was talking about the fact that, the Japanese are a spent force. They are nowhere near to being able to eclipse the strong British forces with our fleets of ships and so on. And interestingly, even though that was from the 1940s, the pictures that they used to depict the Japanese were from the late 1800s, where they looked very primitive and they looked very backward, and then they assured themselves confidently that, we've got it here in Southeast Asia. The Japanese are nowhere near. And when I looked at that, I thought to myself, that's the ultimate fake news, right? And it was really about, shoring up the confidence, the feelings of the British people, and exactly as you were saying about emotions, right? You're stirring the emotions, you're getting people sort of excited, and you're getting people to feel this sense of pride, if you will, false pride. And very often, I think with a lot of fake news that goes viral, if you look at clickbait, for example, they're very good at using a lot of hooks, a lot of emotional hooks to get people drawn into the story. And then once you draw them in because of that emotional trigger, and these other cognitive biases that I talked about come into play, that's when people tend to let down their guard. And then, of course, on top of that, there's the cognitive load and so on. And then you just think, must be true, right? And then you click it and you share it and so on. And that's really how the bandwagon begins.
Oh, that's so telling, because when your emotions are touched, more often than not, you turn off logic, right? So, I mean, I know that's right. I just know it. How? I just know it, right? So, yes, Edson.
I think it's a good question, but I also wanted to look at the emotional state when you are processing news. So now that more and more of our news consumption happens on social media platforms, and we go there not primarily for information, but for entertainment, to connect with our friends. So we're in a different emotional state. So when we come across a news story, we might value it not for its information value, but for its interrelationship value. Meaning, if I send this to a friend, what would this friend think? Would this humor my friend? Would this make my friend think I care about them, or I remember them because of this? So yeah, I think on social media, one thing that's interesting that's happening is that the way we value news and we regard it is also changing, more relational rather than informational.
Yeah. So in other words, there are so many other factors rather than just rationality. And one of the things that Tyrion said, which I find very interesting, is that when you have a party that's resourceful and resource-rich, then you have a very potent, weaponized propaganda machine, right? I understand, for example, that they're going to launch soon this, they have enough money to do it. They're going to be launching soon a Duterte app. I don't know what for. I don't know what they hope to get from it, but there's going to be a Duterte app, strangely enough. Uh, no, but I find that funny, but at the same time alarming, because you know how much it costs to develop an app. It costs quite a lot, and then to actually run it and administer the app, and for what earthly purpose? Yes, yes, absolutely. To connect to the people directly, so they can go straight to. I just hope it doesn't look like Donkey Kong or something, Super Mario or something. Okay, here are a few questions. Actually, there are a lot of them. Duterte's followers, some 16 million who voted for him, are said to be preaching to the choir now. Apparently, there are over 18 million more Filipinos who are not occupying the same echo chamber. Yet, a widespread opposition to Duterte and his policies, the killings, the political persecution, is not solidifying. Why is that the case? Is there a silent, quote-unquote, majority who just don't care or are put off by the polarizing debates and are choosing to stay away? In other words, this is a note of frustration at the lack of, at the apathy. So can anyone posit why the majority seems to not care? Edson, do you have a theory for that? Yeah, the only Filipino on the board.
I think the best answer is to say that that's an empirical question that can be researched. I don't have a current answer for that. But I think
You've become too Singaporean, Edson. Evading controversial questions.
But I think that's my first answer. The second one is, I think the perception we have of the political divide is different when we just look on social media versus when we actually look at offline.
But you see, I mean, it is frustrating when you think about the numbers that come in, the approval ratings, right after one tumble, one tumble after another. I mean, politically, you'd think, and the approval ratings still remain very high.
Right, but the question, I take it, was the opposite, right? There seems to be not that much hardcore support for him, and yet the majority isn't.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But I can't comment on the Philippines, but I think more generally, I think we do, I guess, need to get real about the way politics, including in democracies, works, right? It has never been really a numbers game. I mean, the numbers just determine in your best case scenario, is not even the case in the US, that whoever the majority votes for gets into office. Yeah? That's all it does. Beyond that, there is no simple translation from public opinion into policy or action. Yeah? That depends a lot on the institutions and the way not all institutions are that porous or that dependent on public opinion anyway. In fact, some institutions, we don't even want them to be porous to public opinion. I mean, the courts, for example. Yeah? The courts in proper democratic functioning should be completely blind to the state of public opinion because they are governed by law, not by popularity. Yeah? Other institutions should be more amenable to serving the people, but because of corruption, because of vested interests and so on, don't. And this is just, I think, standard across all polities. Worse in non-democracies, but democracies are not immune to this either. So we shouldn't really be surprised or frustrated because that's just the way the world works. You know, it's not enough. And maybe this is one of the other downsides of the social media internet age. It has given us simply because we now have the power to express ourselves so freely, bypassing gatekeepers, bypassing institutions, we can now have our say. But that has not really transformed the underlying way in which politics works. You know? No, public opinion still has never really counted and will never count. It depends, change depends on action, not what opinion polls or the number of friends you have and so on say. And we should get used to that. Yeah.
Yeah, in other words, in many cases, it's the people who participate and the ones with the loudest voices that end up getting their way. There's a comment here. There is an app, at least two, Duterte versus Zombies, and Duterte Fighting Crime 1, and Duterte Fighting Crime 2. Okay, so here's another question. Noting that hate propaganda isn't entirely made up, and with the landscape of of the Philippine social media, is this battle going to be a race to the most effective political propaganda from all sides? In other words, this guy's asking, or girl, can you fight without succumbing to using the playbook? Is that possible? Can you fight back without using the squid tactics that your enemy uses on you? Or do you need to use the same weapons? Tyrion, I think.
I understand tomorrow's session is about solutions. This is supposed to be the very bleak session where we just focus on problems. Right?
Okay, don't answer that so that they come back tomorrow, okay?
In one line, I would just say that the answer probably is to be found in much more long-term interventions. Not so much, well, in addition to media literacy, I think we need political literacy, right? We need to teach people the value in a democracy of respecting one another's human rights, respect for difference. And that itself, if people get that message, actually will inoculate them against hate propaganda.
This is another question. How do we disseminate? I mean, some of the questions here seem to me to be expressions of exasperation. For example, how do we disseminate info and reach out to people on the other side of the filter, bubble, or echo chambers? In other words, it feels so hard to get. Well, I mean, I don't know if any of you have actually tried to go into, there's a site on Facebook called the Duterte News Facebook site. Have you ever tried posting there? Okay, no, see? I mean, who's brave enough to do that? And I did try at one time, to my extreme regret. Okay. Okay, so who wants to answer that? How the hell do we disseminate info and reach out to the people on the other side of the bubbles or echo chambers? Anyone wants to posit or to venture a response?
There was a study done in the US on this whole echo chamber effect, and the study concluded that actually the echo chamber is a myth, that people are rather more omnivorous than we had previously assumed, and that people actually do sort of consume a range of opinions rather than just what necessarily resonates with them, at least within social media, at least in the US context. I'm not sure how, if you replicated that in other countries, it would pan out. But what troubles me most about discussing this issue is that ultimately we actually only have half the picture. We really don't know the algorithms that big tech is using to prescribe and to serve up all of these different stories, whether they are going to exacerbate the echo chamber or whether they can somehow dispel them. And every day you are getting a new Facebook experiment on you where they are, changing the way your newsfeed is appearing. One day I woke up and all of my newsfeed was all these, rather boring members of Parliament of Singapore whose pages I had followed some months ago. And I was, flummoxed, right? And suddenly all my cool friends' posts were not showing up. And I just felt like a guinea pig in, the lab. So fundamentally, when it comes to this whole echo chamber thing, what can we do? Well, we really need more transparency. We really need more regulation of big technology. We really need to know what it is they are doing in order to make the decisions that really influence the information landscape that we are inhabiting before we can start to talk about echo chambers.
I just want to, I'm so glad that you brought that up, regulating Facebook. Although I'm allergic to the idea of regulation, because that's just one step away from censorship, I think we need to start respecting net neutrality. I mean, with all due respect to Smart, who's supporting us today, it's like biting the hand that's feeding us. I mean, the whole idea that they can give away Facebook for free is you're really doing a disservice to all the news gatherers by putting them on equal footing in Facebook. The news gatherers who use rigorous methods to gather their news, to put them on equal footing with the fake news and have people sift through that is a disservice. That's just my opinion. How can mainstream media effectively address disinformation? How can they draw the line between stopping these info from getting more attention and addressing them? Again, it's a very complex problem. Again, net neutrality is one of the issues that need to be, addressed, right? Yes, Edson.
One thing that I've been thinking about is also, because of the reality of the, how we should write based on the algorithms, based on Google search terms, even our headline writing in journalism has changed. The rules of headline writing have changed. But I think the more we play by these rules, it also becomes a disservice to readers, especially readers who use free data. If they only see clickbait headlines and they don't get to click on it because they don't have data, they don't have free data, then they don't really get to learn what the story is about. And there's a lot of those people who use Facebook using free data. So I think just by that alone, I think it's a disservice to keep on writing clickbait headlines that people cannot afford to click anyway.
Yes, so that's really very interesting because pretty soon I think our Senate is going to be calling in the telecommunications people. And in fairness to them, I think they didn't think about the consequences of their acts because it's really it's really commercial considerations. However, it has ramifications far beyond commerce, obviously. Question for Edson. Stigma of being corrected. How should the press and the concerned public in general handle onion-skinned politicians like Duterte? I didn't say this, okay? I mean, hello, someone sent this in. Onion-skinned politicians like Duterte who have strong aversion for criticism.
That's a tough question, and I've been out of journalism for a couple of years. I think it's I've been hearing that a lot of journalists who do comments or editorials on fake news would say that we just to keep on doing what we've been doing, but it is a new problem that we're facing in a scale that we've never seen. So I think journalism has to be open to also doing something different. In terms of how do we then deal with politicians who are averse with regards to negative, I think with the earlier panel talked about reaching out to these government agencies, telling them how journalism actually works. So media literacy, but on the part of government agencies. I mean, I think that hopefully would help. But I don't have a short-term answer. That will take a while.
Okay, okay. I actually have two more questions, but I can't. I'm going to ask you, and you're going to have to answer personally to whoever asked it. So, to Cherry and George, what is your opinion of the situation in Jammu Kashmir, Indian administered land, but majority of the people are Muslims? You're just going to have to look at that on your own. And some people assume that Free FB or the well, whatever this is, are more prone to disinformation. Is there evidence to this? I don't know. Again, it's something that that the people here in the know might want to think about and perhaps respond to. By the way, to the moderators earlier, may I, another one, may I request that you give in your questions just so that we are able to log them all in. And both Trump and Duterte rose to power on populist sentiments fueled by disinformation that feeds on divisive racial economic views. What parallelisms can be drawn from these two populist leaders Well, I can answer that. Well, especially as to why people chose to turn a blind eye on decency over demagoguery. Well, you know, you answered your question somewhat there. So I'm going to have to move on because we are out of time, unfortunately. Unfortunately for us, because this has been very interesting, and solutions have started to show their bald heads in the swimming pool, but not yet their face. So, so tomorrow, the rest of it is, I think tomorrow is the day for solutions. I'd like to thank my panelists. Oh, 2 minutes, each of you, to say something.
I'll make it shorter than 2 minutes. I'm going to model good behavior online and offline and be the change that I want to see in the way that I answer the question on Jammu and Kashmir. Because I think those of us who have even a little bit of influence over family, friends, etc., should always try to limit your comments and your sharing to things you actually know something about, right? And since I know nothing about the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, word sharing, I will simply decline. Thank you.
Well, that's okay. Thank you very much, Tyrion. Yes, San.
It's going to be hard to beat that. But really, I think as someone who's worked on media literacy for the longest time, and I know Claire Waddle is sort of allergic to the term fake news, but I thought it was a gift, really, because suddenly, you know, everyone woke up and realized it was a collective problem, and I've actually seen the term fake news become some kind of galvanizing force for society in general. So I've been really sort of quite liberal about using it in order just to get people passionate about this whole problem and how to rectify it. But indeed, it's a very long, drawn problem, and it's going to be with us for a while. And we really need to think about creative solutions, which I will share a little bit more about tomorrow during the morning workshop.
Yay!
Yes, I agree. I think what we're seeing is it's nice that we are all cooperating. We're not only from doing research at the academe, but also with having dialogues with journalists and even policymakers. So it's nice that people are working on this real problem, and we'll be here tomorrow for Sun and the rest of the sessions for solutions.
Okay, thank you guys. That was wonderful. Bitin. I don't know if you know the word bitin, but that's what it is.